There comes a moment in every mother's life when the silence becomes unbearable. When Isolde buried her son beside his father, she knew she had lost more than her family. She had lost her reason to wake each morning. At 55, the widowed healer travels to the Blackwood Mountains, seeking the legendary vampire who grants oblivion to desperate souls. She wants one night to forget her pain. Lucien, the ancient alpha vampire, expects another brief encounter with a mortal seeking escape. But when two broken hearts meet in the darkness, something unexpected happens. Her grief speaks to his centuries of loneliness. His immortal strength becomes her refuge. What begins as a desperate bargain transforms into a forbidden love that threatens the very foundations of their world. When the church and nobility unite against them, will their bond survive the forces trying to tear them apart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Isolde like the breath of ghosts, and Isolde Blackthorn moved through it with the practiced silence of a woman who had learned to carry grief without disturbing the world around her. Her healing satchel, worn smooth by decades of faithful service, hung heavy against her hip as she made her way through the narrow streets toward the cottage that had once been filled with laughter. The leather bag had been a wedding gift from Thomas, her beloved blacksmith husband, crafted with the same meticulous care he brought to forging horseshoes and plowshares. Each pocket had been designed to hold specific herbs, each compartment carefully measured to accommodate her tools of healing. Now it felt like a burden she could no longer bear to carry, yet could not bring herself to abandon. Isolde paused at the threshold of her cottage, her weathered hand resting on the oak door Thomas had hung 30 years ago. The wood bore the marks of his craftsmanship, smooth joints, careful attention to the grain, hinges that still swung without a whisper of protest. Everything he touched had been built to last, to endure long past his own mortal span. Everything except his own body, broken on some distant battlefield in service to lords who would never remember his name. Inside, the cottage felt cavernous, despite its modest size. The herb garden beyond the kitchen window had grown wild in her neglect, chamomile and lavender tangling together in a riot of untended growth. She had once tended those plants with the devotion of a mother, knowing that each careful cutting might ease a fever, each properly dried bundle might bring comfort to someone's pain. Now the sight of them only reminded her of the medicines she had not been able to brew, the healing she had not been able to provide when it mattered most. The great room still held the furniture Thomas had, built a sturdy table, scarred by years of meal preparation, chairs worn smooth by the weight of family gatherings, a mantelpiece that had once displayed the small treasures of a happy life. Marcus had carved his initials into the table's edge when he was 7, earning a gentle scolding that dissolved into laughter when Thomas discovered the boy had been trying to copy his father's mark on a particularly fine piece of ironwork. Isolde ran her fingers over those initials now, feeling the rough edges her son's small knife had left in the wood. Marcus had grown into a man who possessed his father's strength and his mother's gentle heart, a combination that made him beloved in the village and devastating to lose. He had followed Thomas to war not out of duty but out of love, unable to bear the thought of his father facing danger alone. They had died within moments of each other, the messenger had told her. Thomas protecting his son until the very end, Marcus refusing to leave his father's side. The silver locket at her throat held their faces, painted in miniature by a traveling artist who had passed through Isolde the summer before the war began. Thomas's steady brown eyes gazed out from the tiny portrait with the quiet confidence that had first drawn her to him at a village festival 40 years ago. Marcus smiled beside him with the easy joy of a young man who had never known real sorrow, his dark hair catching the light the same way his father's had before silver had begun to thread through it. She had been the village healer for longer than most residents could remember, the woman people sought when their children burned with fever or their bones ached with the changing seasons. Her cottage had been a place of refuge, filled with the scents of drying herbs and the quiet murmur of compassionate care. Mothers had brought their infants to her table, trusting her to ease their suffering. Fathers had carried injured sons to her door, knowing she would do everything in her power to mend what was broken. The irony was not lost on her that she, who had spent her life healing others, had been powerless to save the two people who mattered most. All her knowledge of herbs and remedies, all her understanding of the body's ways of mending itself, had been useless when Thomas and Marcus needed her most. She had not even been given the chance to try, robbed of the opportunity to pour her love into one final attempt at healing by the simple fact of distance and the chaos of war. Father Benedict had tried to comfort her in those first terrible weeks after the messenger arrived. The elderly priest had sat at her kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea that grew cold, while he spoke of God's mysterious ways and the peace that awaited the faithful. His words had been meant kindly, she knew, but they had struck her like stones thrown against glass, shattering what little faith she had managed to preserve through previous sorrows. Elena Hartwell, her closest friend since childhood, had been more practical in her attempts to help. The baker's wife had appeared each morning for a month, bringing fresh bread and sitting in companionable silence while Isolde struggled to find reasons to continue living. Elena understood grief. She had buried 2 children in infancy and a husband who died young of a wasting disease, but even her seasoned sympathy could not penetrate the wall of numbness that had settled around Isolde's heart. The village had tried to rally around her, offering the kind of support small communities provide for their wounded members. Patients still came to her door, seeking remedies, perhaps hoping that the familiar routine of healing might restore some spark of life to their beloved healer. But Isolde found herself going through the motions with mechanical precision, mixing tinctures and binding wounds while feeling utterly disconnected from her own actions. It was during one of those hollow consultations that she first heard the stories that would change everything. Old Willem, the village's longest surviving inhabitant, had come to her seeking relief from the joint pain that plagued his winters. While she prepared a poultice for his aching hands, he had begun telling stories to pass the time, tales of the mountains that loomed beyond Ashenhall's borders, like sleeping giants cloaked in perpetual mist. The Blackwood Mountains had always been a source of local legend, their peaks shrouded in clouds that never quite lifted, their forests dark with shadows that seemed to move independently of the wind. Willem spoke of ancient creatures that dwelled in those heights, beings that had walked the earth since before the first stones of Ashenhall were laid. Most of his stories were the familiar folklore of rural communities, tales of spirits and strange lights that served more to entertain children than to frighten adults. But one story was different. Willem had leaned close, his voice dropping to a whisper as he spoke of the alpha vampire said to inhabit a castle lost in the mountain mists. This creature, according to the old man's tale, was not the mindless monster of children's nightmares, but an ancient being of terrible beauty and power. Those brave enough or desperate enough to seek him out might find what they were looking for, though the price was always higher than expected. The story had taken root in Isolde's mind, like a seed planted in fertile soil. She found herself thinking of it during the long nights when sleep eluded her, wondering what price she would be willing to pay for a single night of peace. The idea grew stronger with each passing week, fed by her increasing desperation and the growing certainty that she could not continue living in a world emptied of love. She began to make preparations with the methodical care of someone who had spent a lifetime planning for contingencies. Her healing supplies were organized and labeled with detailed instructions left for Elena to distribute among the village's most needy families. The cottage was cleaned and ordered, her few valuables arranged where they might do the most good for those she would leave behind. She even wrote letters to Father Benedict, thanking him for his years of spiritual guidance, despite her recent loss of faith. To Elena, expressing gratitude for a friendship that had sustained her through decades of joy and sorrow. The black mourning veil she had worn to both funerals lay folded in her drawer, its silk surface unmarked by the tears she had been unable to shed since that terrible day when her world collapsed. She took it out now, running the fabric between her fingers as she contemplated the journey ahead. It seemed fitting that the symbol of her grief should accompany her on this final pilgrimage, this last desperate attempt to find something resembling peace. The night she chose for her departure was moonless, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain before dawn. Isolde, dressed in her simplest clothing, a dark woolen dress that would not catch the light, sturdy boots that could handle rough terrain, a cloak that would provide warmth during the mountain's chill. She braided her silver-streaked hair carefully, securing it with pins that would not come loose during travel, and placed the mourning veil in her satchel alongside the few supplies she judged necessary for the journey. Before leaving, she stood for a long moment in the doorway of the cottage, memorizing the life she was about to abandon. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, the familiar furniture strange and distant in the pre-dawn darkness. She touched the locket at her throat one final time, whispering a goodbye to the faces it contained, then stepped into the street and began walking toward the mountains. The village slept around her as she made her way to its outskirts, windows dark and chimneys cold in the hours before sunrise. Dogs might have barked. At her passage in daylight, children might have called greetings from doorways. But in this suspended time between night and morning, she moved like a ghost through the place that had been her home for more than half a century. Behind her, Ashenhall settled deeper into slumber, unaware that its healer was walking away forever. Ahead lay the Blackwood Mountains, and whatever waited in their shadowed peaks, death, oblivion, or perhaps something she had not yet imagined. For the first time in months, Isolde felt something that might have been anticipation stirring in her chest, a faint warmth that almost resembled hope. The ancient map had come from a dying stranger, pressed into Isolde's hands with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves. The traveller had appeared at her cottage door 3 nights before her planned journey, his face gaunt with fever and his eyes bright with approaching death. She had done what she could to ease his passing, brewing willow bark tea for his pain and sitting beside his makeshift bed as darkness gathered around them. In his final lucid moments, he had gripped her wrist with surprising strength and whispered of the paths that led to the vampire's domain. The parchment he gave her was older than anything she had ever seen, its surface marked with symbols that seemed to shift in candlelight and roots that appeared to have been drawn by a hand guided by intimate knowledge of the mountain's secrets. "The price is always higher than expected," he had warned, echoing Willem's words with an urgency that made her skin prickle. "But sometimes what we find is worth more than what we sought." She had buried him in the village cemetery the next morning, his name unknown, his story untold, except for the cryptic map that now guided her through terrain that seemed to exist outside the normal world. The Blackwood Mountains at night were a realm unto themselves, ancient beyond measure and hostile to human presence. Isolde followed the map's winding paths through forests where moonlight never touched the ground, where the air itself seemed thick with watching presences and the very stones beneath her feet hummed with otherworldly energy. Her breath formed clouds in air that grew colder with each step upward, and more than once she heard sounds that had no earthly source, whispers in languages that predated human speech, the rustle of movement through underbrush where no living thing should dwell. The path marked on the ancient parchment led her through a narrow pass between towering peaks, where the walls of stone seemed to close overhead like the ribs of some enormous sleeping beast. Here the darkness was so complete that she had to feel her way forward one step at a time, her hands pressed against rock that felt warm to the touch despite the mountain's chill. The sensation unnerved her more than the cold or the darkness. Stone should not pulse with what felt disturbingly like a heartbeat. When she finally emerged from the pass, the sight that greeted her defied every expectation she had formed during her climb. A vast valley opened before her, shrouded in mists that moved with deliberate purpose rather than natural wind patterns. At its heart rose a castle that seemed to have been carved from the mountain itself, its spires reaching toward clouds that swirled in patterns too regular to be coincidental. The structure was impossibly ancient, built in an architectural style that predated any kingdom Isolde knew. Its walls were constructed from black stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect what little light filtered through the supernatural mists, and windows glowed with a pale radiance that had nothing to do with flame or candle. As she watched, she could have sworn she saw the shadows moving across its towers in ways that suggested the castle was not entirely solid, not entirely bound by the physical laws that governed the world she knew. The approach to the castle followed a causeway of white stone that appeared to float above the swirling mists. Each step forward required an act of faith that the path would support her weight. And more than once, Isolde felt the vertigo of looking down into depths that seemed to have no bottom. The mists below moved like living things, occasionally parting to reveal glimpses of landscapes that could not possibly exist in the same space, forests of silver trees under starless skies, lakes of perfectly still water that reflected no light. The castle's entrance was a massive archway, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, designs that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed from the corner of her eye. No guards stood watch, no servants appeared to challenge her presence, yet Isolde felt observed from the moment she set foot on the causeway. The sensation was not threatening precisely, but it carried the weight of ancient attention, focused with laser intensity on her approach. The great doors opened before she could knock, moving inward with perfect silence to reveal a hall that defied the castle's external dimensions. The space stretched away from her in directions that seemed mathematically impossible, lit by sources of light she could not identify. Tapestries covered walls that rose beyond the reach of vision, their images depicting scenes of beauty and terror in equal measure. Battles between creatures of myth, lovers embracing beneath alien stars, cities that existed in dreams rather than reality. You have traveled far for someone seeking oblivion. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the hall with a quality that made her bones vibrate in harmony. Isolde turned slowly, her heart hammering despite her resolution to face whatever awaited her with dignity, and saw him materialize from shadows that had seemed empty moments before. Lucien was nothing like the monster of folklore, tall and lean with the kind of classical beauty that belonged in marble statuary. He moved with fluid grace that spoke of centuries spent perfecting every gesture. His hair was dark as the space between stars, and his eyes held depths that seemed to contain the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of millennia. He was dressed simply in black clothing that managed to look both timeless and elegant, and when he smiled, she caught a glimpse of fangs that were somehow more beautiful than terrible. "I seek one night of forgetting," Isolde said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I was told you might grant such a thing to those who ask properly." His laugh was like music played in a minor key, beautiful and melancholy in equal measure. "Properly? And what would constitute a proper request in your estimation?" She reached into her satchel and withdrew the items she had brought as payment, a vial of her finest healing oil, pressed from herbs grown in soil consecrated by decades of prayer, a silver coin that had been her grandmother's, and finally, the mourning veil that had covered her face at the funerals of her heart. "I offer what I have of value," she said, laying the items on a table that appeared beside her without her notice. "My skill as a healer, what little wealth remains to me, and my grief itself, if you have use for such things." Lucien approached the offerings with interest that seemed genuine rather than mocking. He lifted the vial of oil and inhaled its scent, his expression showing appreciation for its quality. The silver coin he examined with the eye of someone who had seen empires rise and fall, nations mint their currencies and watch them turn to dust. But when his fingers touched the mourning veil, his entire demeanor changed. "This has been worn at fresh graves," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been recognition or even compassion. "The grief it holds is profound. A mother's loss, a wife's sorrow. You have buried more than one beloved." "My husband and son," Isolde confirmed, lifting her chin with pride that refused to be diminished by sorrow. "Both died in service to lords who have already forgotten their names. I have spent months trying to find a way to continue living in a world that no longer contains them. I cannot. I will not. One night of forgetting their absence, and you may have whatever remains of my life afterward." Something shifted in the vampire's expression, a flicker of recognition that suggested her words had struck deeper than expected. He set the veil down with careful reverence, as if it were a holy relic rather than a simple piece of silk. "You speak of forgetting as if it were a gift," he said softly. "But I have lived for 8 centuries, madam, and I can tell you that memory, even painful memory, is often the only thing that gives existence meaning. Are you certain you wish to trade your grief for emptiness?" "I am certain I cannot continue carrying it," she replied. "Whether that makes me weak or wise, I no longer care to determine." He studied her for a long moment, his ancient eyes taking in details that mortal perception would miss. When he finally nodded, it was with the solemnity of someone agreeing to a sacred compact. "Very well, I accept your offer, though not perhaps in the way you expect. Come." He led her deeper into the castle, through corridors lined with portraits of faces beautiful and strange, past windows that looked out onto landscapes that changed with each glance. The room he brought her to was warmly appointed, despite its impossible elegance, with a fireplace that burned without consuming wood and furnishings that seemed to adjust themselves to accommodate her presence. "What happens now?" Isolde asked, surprised to find herself curious rather than afraid. "Now," Lucien said, settling into a chair across from her, "we discover what you truly came here seeking, and I suspect, my dear Isolde Blackthorn, that it was not oblivion at all." The silver locket felt heavier against Isolde's chest as she made her way back down the mountain path, though she knew the weight came not from the portraits it contained, but from the memories it now seemed to amplify. What had transpired in Lucien's castle defied every expectation she had carried into the mountains, leaving her more confused than consoled and strangely reluctant to return to the hollow existence that awaited her in Ashenhall. Their night together had not brought the oblivion she had sought. Instead of forgetting her pain, she had found herself speaking of Thomas and Marcus with a clarity she had not possessed since their deaths, sharing memories that had been too precious to voice aloud during the lonely months of mourning. Lucien had listened with an attention that seemed to honor every word, asking questions that revealed both genuine interest and understanding of loss that ran deeper than sympathy. She had expected to wake, feeling emptied, cleansed of the grief that had been consuming her life like a slow poison. Instead, she felt strangely restored, as if speaking her love aloud to someone who truly comprehended its value had somehow transformed its weight from burden to treasure. The pain remained, but it no longer felt like it was destroying her from within. The vampire himself had been a revelation that challenged everything she thought she knew about his kind. Instead of the predatory monster of folklore, she had found a being of profound loneliness, whose centuries of existence had taught him to value connection above all other things. He spoke of mortality with the reverence of someone who had watched civilizations rise and fall, who understood that the temporary nature of human life made it infinitely precious rather than insignificantly brief. When dawn approached and she prepared to leave, he had walked her to the castle's entrance with courtesy that belonged to an earlier, more gracious age. She had expected him to dismiss her from his thoughts the moment she departed, but Something in his manner suggested their encounter had affected him as well. He had taken her hand in farewell, and she could have sworn she felt reluctance in his touch. "You will return to your healing," he had said, though it sounded more like a question than a prediction. "I do not know," she had answered honestly. "I no longer know what purpose my life should serve." "Purpose is not something we find," he replied, his ancient eyes holding wisdom she was only beginning to appreciate. "It is something we create through the choices we make each day. Your grief has not ended your story, Isolde. It has simply marked the beginning of a new chapter." Now, as she approached the outskirts of Ashenhall in the grey light of early morning, those words echoed in her mind with growing resonance. The village looked exactly as she had left it, humble cottages, with smoke beginning to rise from morning fires, gardens where industrious wives would soon emerge to tend their herbs, streets that would fill with the comfortable rhythms of rural life. Yet somehow it all appeared different to her eyes, as if her night in the castle had shifted her perspective in ways she was only beginning to understand. Elena Hartwell was waiting at her cottage, sitting on the wooden bench Thomas had built beside the front door. The baker's wife held a covered basket that undoubtedly contained fresh bread, and her expression carried the mixture of relief and concern that Isolde had come to recognize as the face of friendship tested by worry. "You were not in your bed when I came to check on you yesterday evening," Elena said without preamble, rising to embrace her friend with fierce affection. "I have been here since before dawn, imagining every terrible fate that might have befallen you." Isolde returned the embrace, surprised by how much comfort she drew from this simple human contact after the supernatural intimacy of the previous night. Elena smelled of yeast and cinnamon, familiar, scents that anchored her to the world she had nearly abandoned. "I needed time alone to think," Isolde said, which was true enough without being complete. "I walked in the hills and spent the night under stars that reminded me how vast the world is beyond my small sorrows." Elena studied her friend's face with the sharp perception that came from decades of friendship. "There is something different about you this morning. You look like yourself for the first time since the terrible news arrived." The observation was more accurate than Elena could have known. Isolde did feel more like herself, though it was a version of herself she had not encountered before, a woman capable of surviving devastating loss without being destroyed by it, someone whose capacity for love had not been diminished by grief, but rather deepened by it. "Perhaps I am finally beginning to heal," Isolde said, testing the words as she spoke them. "The wound is still there, but it no longer feels like it is, bleeding me to death." They went inside together, Elena unpacking her basket, while Isolde built up the fire and set water to boil for tea. The familiar domestic rituals felt both comforting and strange, as if she were performing actions remembered from a previous life, rather than continuing the routine of her current existence. "Mrs. Fleming came by yesterday afternoon," Elena said as she arranged warm rolls on a wooden plate. "Her youngest has been running a fever for 3 days. She hoped you might have something to help." Isolde found herself nodding before she consciously decided to respond. "I will prepare a tincture this morning. Willow bark and elderflower should bring the fever down, and if the child will drink it, honey mead with crushed garlic to prevent it from settling in her chest." The words came easily, knowledge and instinct, combining in ways that felt natural for the first time in months. She moved to her herb cabinet and began gathering the necessary ingredients, her hands remembering the motions of healing as if they had never stopped. Elena watched this transformation with obvious wonder. "You sound like the Isolde who taught me to treat my husband's cough with sage and thyme 20 years ago. I had begun to fear that woman was gone forever." "Not gone," Isolde said, measuring dried elderflowers into a ceramic bowl. "Simply lost for a while. Sometimes we must travel very far from ourselves to remember who we truly are." As she worked, Isolde found her thoughts drifting back to the castle and its enigmatic master. She wondered what Lucien was doing in the daylight hours, whether vampires truly slept as folklore suggested, or if they simply retreated from a sun that could not touch their immortal flesh. The idea that he might be thinking of her seemed both impossible and strangely likely. Father Benedict arrived as she was finishing Mrs. Fleming's medicine, his weathered face bright with relief at finding her not only alive, but apparently restored to something resembling her former self. The elderly priest had been genuinely worried about her spiritual welfare during the darkest period of her mourning, and his joy at seeing her engaged in healing work again was clearly heartfelt. "My child," he said, taking her hands in his with paternal affection, "it does my heart good to see you returning to the work that has always been your calling. I have prayed daily for your restoration, and it appears those prayers have been answered." Isolde managed a smile that felt more genuine than any expression she had worn in months. "Perhaps they have been, Father, though the answer came in a form I did not expect." She spent the morning visiting patients who had been waiting patiently for her return to active practice, carrying her healing satchel through streets that no longer felt like a prison, but rather like a community that needed her skills. Each successful treatment, each grateful smile from a relieved parent or spouse seemed to restore another piece of the purpose she had thought was lost forever. Yet underneath this return to normalcy, she carried the memory of Lucien's voice, his understanding, and the strange sense that their encounter had been a beginning rather than an ending. The silver locket still held the faces of her beloved dead, but it no longer felt like a weight dragging her toward the grave. Instead, it had become a reminder of her capacity for deep love, a capacity that had not died with Thomas and Marcus, but remained, perhaps, to be offered again in ways she could not yet imagine. The bloodstone ring had been forged in an age when vampires walked openly among mortals, its dark crimson surface etched with symbols that predated written language. Lucien wore it on his right hand, a reminder of power and position that had once commanded respect across kingdoms, now turned to dust. But in the 3 days since Isolde's visit, the ancient artifact had begun to exhibit properties that puzzled even its immortal bearer. The stone grew warm whenever his thoughts turned to the silver-haired healer, pulsing with gentle heat that seemed to echo the rhythm of a heartbeat he no longer possessed. At first he had dismissed the phenomenon as coincidence, but as the warmth intensified with each memory of their conversation, he was forced to acknowledge that something unprecedented was occurring. Lucien stood at the great window of his castle's highest tower, gazing down at the valley that had been his domain for 8 centuries. The mists that perpetually shrouded his realm moved at his will, responding to emotions and intentions as naturally as his own limbs. Yet today they swirled with patterns he had not consciously commanded, forming spirals that seemed to reach toward the distant village where Isolde had returned to her mortal life. He had spent countless nights over the centuries, entertaining visitors who came seeking various forms of escape or transformation. Most wanted immortality, driven by fear of death or hunger for power. Others sought revenge against enemies, begging for the strength to destroy those who had wronged them. A few came for pleasure, drawn by tales of vampire seduction that contained just enough truth to be compelling. None had ever asked simply to forget their pain. None had touched him with such unguarded honesty or spoken of love with reverence that made his ancient heart ache with recognition. Isolde had not tried to impress him with her beauty or intelligence, had not attempted to bargain for more than she had offered. She had simply shared her grief with someone she trusted to understand it, and in doing so had given him something he had not realized he was missing. The memory of her voice, describing her husband and son, haunted him with its tenderness. She had spoken of Thomas's gentle hands and Marcus's bright laughter, of Sunday mornings when they would all work together in the herb garden, of winter evenings when they would sit by the fire and share stories until the logs burned down to embers. Her love for them had been so profound, so completely without reservation, that it had reminded him of what he had lost when mortality was stripped away. He found himself drawn to the edge of his domain as sunset approached, walking paths he had not traveled in decades, to stand where the supernatural mists thinned enough to glimpse the world beyond. From this vantage point, he could see the lights beginning to kindle in Ashenhall's windows, families gathering for evening meals, children being called in from their play. The domesticity of it should have seemed alien to a creature of his nature, yet instead, it filled him with longing he thought had been burned out of him centuries ago. The bloodstone ring pulsed with increasing warmth as he watched smoke rise from Isolde's chimney. He imagined her moving through her cottage with renewed purpose, tending to patients who had missed. Her healing touch, perhaps sitting at the table where her family had once shared their meals. The image stirred something in him that was both beautiful and painful, a yearning for connection that transcended the temporary encounters that had sustained him through his immortal existence. When full darkness fell, he found himself walking toward the village, without having made a conscious decision to leave his castle. The journey that would have taken immortal hours passed in moments as he moved through shadows that bent to accommodate his passage. He had not visited the world of mortals in decades, preferring to let them come to him when they sought what he could offer, but tonight isolation felt less like protection than imprisonment. Ashenhall slept peacefully around him as he materialized from the darkness at its edge. The houses were humble but well-maintained, gardens tended with care that spoke of pride in simple accomplishments. He could hear the steady breathing of sleeping families, smell the lingering scents of hearth fires and evening meals, sense the quiet contentment of lives lived according to natural rhythms. Isolde's cottage stood slightly apart from its neighbors, surrounded by the herb garden that had clearly been recently restored to order. Light glowed softly in one window, and he could see her silhouette moving within as she worked by candlelight. She was grinding something in a mortar and pestle, her movements careful and precise, and he found himself captivated by the simple grace of her actions. He remained in the shadows, reluctant to disturb her but unable to leave. Watching her work filled him with peace he had not experienced in centuries, a sense of rightness that made the endless years of solitude seem suddenly unbearable. She paused in her work to touch the silver locket at her throat, and he saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer or simply words of remembrance for those she had lost. When she moved to the window and he looked out into the night, their eyes met across the darkness with an inevitability that felt like destiny finally arriving. She showed no surprise at seeing him there, only a quiet recognition that suggested she had been expecting this moment. "You came," she said softly, opening the cottage door and stepping out into the garden, where moonlight turned her silver hair to spun starlight. "I did not intend to," he admitted, approaching with the cautious grace of a predator who had forgotten how to be anything else. "Yet I found myself unable to remain away." She studied his face with the perceptive eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the truth behind people's words. "What draws you here, Lucien? Surely not the simple conversation of a village healer." "Perhaps it is exactly that," he replied, surprised by his own honesty. "I have spent 8 centuries surrounded by those who wanted something from me: power, immortality, revenge. You asked only to be understood. Do you know how rare such a thing is?" "Rarer than it should be," she agreed, gesturing toward the bench where Elena had waited for her return. "Will you sit with me? I was just brewing tea for tomorrow's patients, but I find I have made far more than I need." They sat together in the quiet garden, surrounded by the scents of chamomile and lavender, while she served tea in simple ceramic cups that had been her grandmother's. The domesticity of it should have felt strange to an immortal being, yet instead it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. "Tell me about loneliness," she said after they had sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. "Not the temporary solitude of mortals, but the endless isolation of immortality. How does one bear such a thing?" Her question cut straight to the heart of his existence with surgical precision. "One learns to find meaning in small moments," he said finally. "A perfect sunset, a piece of music that captures something true, brief, and connections with others who understand that beauty is more precious because it cannot last forever. And yet you are here, seeking connection with someone whose life will pass in what must seem like moments to you. Perhaps that is exactly why I am here, he said, the bloodstone ring growing warm against his finger as he spoke the truth he had been avoiding. Your mortality makes every moment we share infinitely valuable. I had forgotten what it felt like to treasure time. The consecrated cross had been blessed by 3 bishops and bathed in holy water drawn from the sacred spring at Canterbury. Father Benedict wore it against his chest like armor, the ornate silver warm against his skin during daylight hours, but growing cold as night approached. Lately, it had begun to burn with an intensity that left marks on his flesh, as if the blessed metal were reacting to some unholy presence, drawing ever closer to his flock. The elderly priest knelt in the empty church, his weathered hands clasped in prayer before the altar, where candles flickered with unsteady light. He had served this community for 30 years, shepherding souls through births and deaths, marriages and sorrows, always trusting in divine providence to guide his way. But now he faced a challenge that tested both his faith and his understanding of the world's hidden dangers. Isolde's transformation had not gone unnoticed. In the week since her mysterious night absence, she had returned to her healing practice with renewed vigor. But there was something different about her that set Father Benedict's spiritual senses on edge. She moved with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly, spoke with a wisdom that appeared to come from sources beyond her mortal experience, and most disturbing of all, she no longer attended Sunday Mass. When he had visited her cottage to inquire about her spiritual welfare, she had received him with courtesy, but maintained a distance that felt like a wall between them. Her answers to his gentle probing had been evasive, and he had noticed that she avoided looking directly at the cross he wore, as if the sight of it caused her discomfort. "Father Benedict, forgive me for calling so late." Elena Hartwell's voice interrupted his prayers, echoing through the church's vaulted space with obvious distress. The baker's wife stood in the doorway, her usually composed features marked by worry that bordered on fear. "Come in, my child," he said, rising from his knees with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested the dampness of mountain nights. "What troubles you at this hour?" Elena approached the altar with hesitant steps, glancing around the empty church as if she feared being overheard. "It is about Isolde. I am concerned that something has happened to her, something that I do not understand, but that frightens me more than I can express." The priest gestured for her to sit beside him in the front pew, noting how she unconsciously moved closer to the altar's protective presence. "Tell me what you have observed." "She is healing again, which should bring me joy," Elena began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the way she works now is different. Yesterday I watched her treat young Timothy Mason's broken arm, and I swear to you that the bones mended beneath her touch faster than should be possible. The child was running about within hours of her ministrations." Father Benedict felt his consecrated cross growing warmer against his chest. Perhaps she has simply rediscovered techniques that grief had made her forget. "There is more," Elena continued, her hands twisting in her lap with nervous energy. "She no longer sleeps at normal hours. I have seen lights in her cottage well past midnight, and twice I have glimpsed her walking in her garden when dawn was still hours away. When I asked her about it, she claimed she was gathering herbs that were more potent when picked under starlight. And you do not believe her." "Explanation?" Elena shook her head emphatically. "Isolde has been my closest friend for 40 years. I know when she is keeping secrets, and whatever she is hiding now is larger than anything I have ever seen her conceal. There is a light in her eyes that was not there before, a vitality that seems to come from an unnatural source." The priest absorbed this information with growing unease, his mind turning to the ancient texts hidden in the church's archives, volumes that spoke of supernatural influences and their effects on mortal souls. He had hoped never to have need of such knowledge, but it seemed the peaceful isolation of Ashenhall was coming to an end. "Has she spoken of traveling beyond the village recently?" he asked carefully. "Perhaps mentioned encounters with strangers or discoveries that might explain her changed demeanor." "She claims she spent a night alone in the hills, seeking solitude to process her grief," Elena replied. "But when she returned, she seemed less like someone who had found peace through prayer than someone who had discovered an entirely new reason for living." Before Father Benedict could respond, the church's heavy wooden doors creaked open to admit an unexpected visitor. Lord Aldrich Voss entered with the confident stride of nobility accustomed to deference, his travelling clothes marking him as recently arrived from distant lands. The nobleman was younger than the priest had expected, perhaps 40 years of age, with sharp features and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of his surroundings. "Father Benedict," Lord Aldrich said, offering a respectful bow that nonetheless conveyed his superior social position. "I apologize for the late hour, but I bring urgent news that concerns the welfare of your community." Elena rose hastily, clearly intimidated by the presence of nobility in their humble church. "I should return to my family, Father. We can continue our conversation another time." "Stay, if you please," Lord Aldrich said with surprising gentleness. "What I have to share may concern your friend Isolde as well, and your observations could prove valuable." The nobleman approached the altar with the ease of someone comfortable in sacred spaces, and Father Benedict noticed that he wore a pendant bearing symbols associated with ancient protective orders. This was not simply a visiting lord, but someone who understood the darker realities that lurked beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. "I have traveled here following reports of supernatural activity in the Blackwood Mountains," Lord Aldrich said without preamble. "My family has maintained watch over these regions for generations, and we have reason to believe that the creature dwelling in those peaks has begun to extend his influence into the surrounding communities." Father Benedict felt his blood chill at these words, even as his consecrated cross grew hot enough to burn his skin. "What manner of creature do you speak of?" "A vampire of considerable age and power," Lord Aldrich replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "One who has remained dormant for decades but appears to have awakened to new purposes. Tell me, have you noticed any changes in your parishioners recently? Unusual behavior, enhanced abilities, or resistance to traditional spiritual comforts?" Elena gasped audibly at these words, her hand flying to her mouth in recognition of exactly what Lord Aldrich was describing. Father Benedict placed a protective arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer to the altar's sanctifying presence. "There may be one individual who exhibits such symptoms," the priest admitted reluctantly. "But she is a woman of good character who has served this community faithfully for decades." "Character means nothing when supernatural corruption takes hold," Lord Aldrich said, with the cold certainty of someone who had witnessed such transformations before. "The vampire's influence begins, subtly enhanced abilities, increased vitality, gradual separation from sacred traditions. But it always progresses toward complete domination of the victim's soul." He reached into his traveling pack and withdrew a leather-bound volume that seemed to radiate its own sense of weight and importance. "This contains records of similar incidents dating back centuries. In every case, the only solution has been swift intervention before the corruption becomes irreversible." Father Benedict accepted the tome with trembling hands, feeling the burden of knowledge he was not certain he wanted to possess. "What form does such intervention take?" "Separation of the victim from the source of corruption," Lord Aldrich replied, "and if necessary, the elimination of that source entirely. I have brought weapons blessed by the highest church authorities, designed specifically for dealing with creatures that have placed themselves beyond the reach of ordinary salvation." The nobleman's words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Father Benedict found himself caught between his duty to protect his flock and his affection for a woman who had devoted her life to healing others. The choice ahead promised to test every principle he held dear, forcing him to decide whether love or law would guide his actions in the dark days to come. The illuminated manuscript lay open on Father Benedict's desk, like a window into nightmare, its vellum pages decorated with gold leaf that caught candlelight and threw dancing shadows across text written in Latin so archaic that the priest struggled to decipher its meaning. Lord Aldrich had left the ancient volume in his care, with instructions to study its contents carefully, warning that the knowledge contained within might be their only hope of saving Isolde's soul. The tome was titled De Vampiris et Eorum Corruptione, on vampires and their corruption, and its pages detailed centuries of church encounters with the undead and their human servants. Each account followed a similar pattern: initial contact between vampire and mortal, gradual transformation of the human through supernatural influence, and finally, the complete domination that rendered salvation impossible through any means save death. What disturbed Father Benedict most profoundly were the descriptions of the bond between vampire and chosen mortal. The manuscript spoke of connections that transcended physical proximity, allowing the undead creature to influence their victims' thoughts, emotions, and even physical capabilities from great distances. It described humans who developed supernatural strength and healing abilities, who could move within human grace and perceive things hidden from ordinary senses. Every symptom matched what Elena had observed in Isolde's recent behavior, and Father Benedict found himself forced to confront the possibility that his beloved parishioner was no longer entirely human. The thought filled him with anguish that was both personal and spiritual. How could a just God allow such corruption to touch someone who had devoted her life to healing others? The manuscript also contained detailed illustrations that made the priest's stomach turn with their graphic depictions of vampire feeding rituals and transformation ceremonies. But it was the final section that truly chilled his blood pages, devoted to the phenomenon of the eternal bond, a connection so profound that it could grant a mortal immortality itself. According to the ancient text, vampires could share their immortal essence with chosen mortals through a ritual that combined blood, will, and supernatural force. Those who underwent such transformation retained their humanity longer than those turned through violence. But the end result was invariably the same: another creature of darkness added to the world's catalogue of supernatural threats. A soft knock at the rectory door interrupted his studies, and Father Benedict quickly closed the manuscript before calling out permission to enter. Elena appeared in the doorway, her face pale with worry and her hands clutching a shawl against the night's chill. "Forgive me for disturbing you so late, Father," she said, stepping into the small room that served as both his study and private sanctuary. "But I had to speak with someone who would understand my fears." "What has happened, my child?" he asked, gesturing for her to take the chair across from his desk while carefully positioning himself to block her view of the hidden manuscript. "I followed Isolde tonight," Elena confessed, her voice thick with shame at the admission. "I know it was wrong to spy on a friend, but my worry overcame my respect for her privacy. She left her cottage after midnight and walked into the forest, moving through darkness as if she could see perfectly despite the absence of moon or stars." Father Benedict felt his heart sink as Elena's words confirmed his worst fears. "Where did she go?" "To a clearing deep in the woods where someone was waiting for her," Elena continued, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. "A man of extraordinary beauty who moved like shadow and spoke with a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I could not hear their words, but I could see the way they looked at each other, the way she leaned into his embrace as if she had found her home at last." The priest gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles went white. "Did you see his face clearly? Could you describe him to others if necessary?" "Dark hair, pale skin, and eyes that seemed to hold starlight," Elena whispered. "He was tall and lean, dressed in clothing that belonged to no fashion I have ever seen, and when he smiled at her, I glimpsed teeth that were not entirely human." Father, I believe Isolde has given her heart to the very creature the visiting Lord warned us about. Before Father Benedict could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the night, growing rapidly closer to the rectory. Both priest and baker's wife moved to the window in time to see Lord Aldrich dismounting from a magnificent stallion, his face grim with purpose, and his hand resting on the pommel of a sword that gleamed with unnatural light. "He has returned sooner than expected," the priest murmured, opening the door before the nobleman could knock. "Father Benedict," Lord Aldrich said without preamble, his voice urgent with barely controlled energy. "I have received word from my contacts in the capital. The situation is more dire than we initially believed." He entered the rectory with Elena, following nervously behind, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the modest surroundings before focusing on the hidden manuscript. "Have you studied the texts I left with you?" "I have begun to do so," Father Benedict replied carefully. "The knowledge they contain is both illuminating and deeply disturbing." "Then you understand the nature of what we face," Lord Aldrich said, settling into a chair with the fluid grace of a trained warrior. "But there are additional factors you must know. My family's archives contain records indicating that this particular vampire, the one called Lucien, has not chosen a mortal companion in over 3 centuries. His sudden interest in your healer suggests motivations that go beyond simple feeding or casual entertainment." Elena gasped at hearing the creature's name spoken aloud, and Father Benedict felt his consecrated cross growing warm against his chest. "What do you believe his intentions to be?" "The creation of an immortal mate," Lord Aldrich replied, with chilling certainty. "Our records indicate that Lucien lost such a companion long ago, destroyed by vampire hunters who failed to eliminate him as well. If he seeks to replace what was taken from him, your Isolde is in far greater danger than mere corruption of her mortal soul." The nobleman reached into his traveling pack and withdrew a dagger whose blade seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The weapon's metal was black as midnight, and its edge was inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "This blade was forged from meteoric iron and blessed by saints whose names are known only to the highest church authorities," he explained. "It is one of the few weapons capable of permanently destroying even the most ancient of vampires. But it must be wielded at close range, and the opportunity for such an attack may come only once." Father Benedict stared at the unholy weapon with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. "You speak of murder, my lord. Surely there must be another way to save Isolde from this creature's influence." "I speak of salvation," Lord Aldrich corrected firmly. "Both for your friend and for all the innocent souls who will suffer if this vampire's plans come to fruition. The bond between them grows stronger with each meeting. Soon it will be too late to sever the connection without destroying them both." Elena had grown progressively paler during this exchange, and now she spoke with a voice that trembled with barely suppressed terror. "There is something else you should know. Tonight, when I watched them together, I saw her drinking from a cup he offered her. The liquid within glowed like starlight, and after she consumed it, her entire being seemed to shimmer as if she were becoming something other than human." The two men exchanged glances heavy with shared understanding of what Elena's observation meant. The transformation had already begun, and time was running out for any hope of reversing what had been set in motion. "We must act tomorrow night," Lord Aldrich declared, with the finality of a man accustomed to making life and death decisions. "The longer we delay, the stronger their bond becomes, and the more difficult it will be to separate them. Are you prepared to do what must be done, Father? Can you choose the salvation of many over your affection for one?" Father Benedict closed his eyes and felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders like a mantle of lead. When he opened them again, his expression held the grim resolve of a man who had found his answer in prayer and duty rather than in the desires of his heart. The dragon's tooth dagger rested in its velvet-lined case like a shard of crystallized darkness, its obsidian blade carved from a fang that had once belonged to the last great worm of the northern wastes. Lord Aldrich ran his fingers along the weapon's ancient surface, feeling the power that hummed within metal, older than recorded history. Few mortals knew that such artifacts existed. Fewer still had ever seen one wielded in battle. But his family had been guardians of this particular blade for 7 generations. The Voss lineage had been vampire hunters since the Dark Ages, when creatures of the night walked openly among men, and the church was still learning how to combat supernatural threats. Each generation had added to the family's accumulated knowledge, building an archive of weapons, techniques, and hard-won wisdom about the nature of immortal evil. Aldrich himself had taken his first vampire's head at the age of 16, guided by a grandfather whose scars told stories of battles that would have broken lesser men. But Lucien was different from the fledgling undead that typically drew the attention of vampire hunters. The creature dwelling in the Blackwood Mountains was ancient beyond measure, powerful enough to reshape reality within his domain, and cunning in ways that came only from centuries of survival. Aldrich's great-grandfather had faced Lucien once before, in the year 1523, and had barely escaped with his life after witnessing the vampire destroy an entire company of armed knights with supernatural force. The family records spoke of that encounter in terms usually reserved for natural disasters, a confrontation with something so far beyond human strength that conventional tactics were worse than useless. Yet even then, Lucien had shown the weakness that all vampires shared: attachment to mortal companions who could be threatened, used as leverage, or turned against their immortal protectors through careful manipulation. "The woman is the key," Aldrich murmured to himself as he studied the detailed maps spread across his table in the inn's private chamber. "She represents both his greatest strength and his most exploitable vulnerability." A soft knock at his door interrupted these contemplations, and Aldrich quickly concealed the dagger before calling out permission to enter. Father Benedict appeared in the doorway, his weathered face marked by sleepless worry and the burden of decisions that weighed heavily on his pastoral conscience. "You sent word that you wished to speak privately," the priest said, settling into the room's single chair with obvious exhaustion. "I confess I am no closer to finding peace with what we must do than I was yesterday evening." Aldrich poured wine from a bottle he had brought from his family's estates, offering a cup to the troubled cleric before taking his own seat at the small table. "There are matters I have not yet shared with you, Father. Information that may change your understanding of what we face and what choices remain available to us." "Speak freely," Father Benedict replied, though his tone suggested he dreaded whatever revelations might follow. "The woman you know as Isolde Blackthorn is not who she appears to be," Aldrich began, withdrawing a leather portfolio from his traveling bags. "My family's genealogical records indicate that she is the last surviving member of the Blackthorn noble house, a bloodline that once held significant lands throughout this region." The priest's eyebrows rose in surprise at this revelation. "Isolde has never spoken of noble heritage. She has always presented herself as the daughter of a village wise woman." "Because that is what she was, raised to believe," Aldrich confirmed, spreading several documents across the table between them. "Look at these records: birth registries, marriage contracts, property deeds, spanning 3 centuries. The Blackthorn family once controlled vast territories that included the very mountains where Lucien has made his lair." Father Benedict studied the papers with growing amazement, his finger tracing family lines that clearly showed Isolde's ancestry reaching back to medieval nobility. "If this is true, why was she raised in poverty? What happened to her family's holdings?" "They were seized by vampire hunters after the original Lord Blackthorn made a pact with Lucien in 1456, Aldrich explained, his voice carrying the weight of historical tragedy. "The nobleman had lost his wife and children to plague and sought immortality to escape his grief. Lucien granted his wish, but the transformation made him a target for my ancestors, who destroyed both him and his immediate heirs." The implications of this revelation struck Father Benedict like a physical blow. You believe Lucien has sought her out because of her bloodline connection to his previous companion. I believe Lucien has been watching the Blackthorn descendants for generations, waiting for one who possessed the right combination of bloodline purity and emotional vulnerability. Aldrich replied grimly. Isolde's recent losses make her the perfect candidate for the same bargain that destroyed her ancestor immortality offered as escape from unbearable grief. Before Father Benedict could respond, urgent knocking echoed through the inn's common room below, followed by voices raised in alarm. Both men moved to the window in time to see Elena Hartwell speaking rapidly to the innkeeper, her face pale with terror, and her clothing disheveled as if she had run through the forest without regard for obstacles. They descended quickly to meet her, finding the baker's wife in a state of near collapse that spoke of experiences beyond ordinary human endurance. Aldrich guided her to a chair, while Father Benedict called for wine to steady her nerves. "They know," Elena gasped between ragged breaths. "Somehow they discovered that I had been watching them. When I returned to the clearing tonight, hoping to learn more about their meetings, they were waiting for me." "What did you see?" Aldrich demanded, his warrior's instincts already calculating threats and responses. "Isolde was different, changed in ways I cannot fully describe," Elena replied, her voice shaking with remembered fear. Her eyes held light that had nothing to do with moon or stars, and when she moved, it was with grace that belonged to no mortal woman. But it was what she said that truly terrified me. Father Benedict leaned forward with growing dread. "What words did she speak?" "She told me that she knew of my visits to you, Father, and of the nobleman who has come asking questions about supernatural threats." Elena continued. "She said that those who would interfere with true love should consider carefully whether their cause was worth the consequences they might face." Aldrich's hand moved instinctively toward the concealed dagger at his side. Did the vampire speak as well? He stood behind her like a shadow given form, and when he smiled, I saw death in his expression, despite the gentleness of his words. Elena whispered. "He said that blood calls to blood across the centuries, and that what was taken from the Blackthorn line would soon be restored." Then he looked directly at me and spoke my name, though I had never met him before in my life. The three companions absorbed this intelligence in silence, heavy with shared understanding of what they now faced. The vampire's knowledge of their activities suggested surveillance capabilities that made their planned intervention far more dangerous than originally anticipated. "There is more," Elena added reluctantly. "As I fled the clearing, I heard Isolde calling after me. She said that the transformation would be completed tomorrow night, and that those who truly cared for her welfare should witness the joy of her rebirth rather than seeking to prevent it." Aldrich stood abruptly, his decision crystallizing with the finality of steel being forged. "Then we have less than 24 hours to act. The ritual she speaks of is the final bonding ceremony that will make her immortal. Once it is completed, she will be lost to us forever." Father Benedict buried his face in his hands, struggling with the impossibility of choosing between his duty to protect souls from damnation and his love for a woman who had devoted her life to serving others. "Is there no way to save her without destroying them both?" "The connection between them has grown too strong," Aldrich replied, with the certainty of someone who had studied such bonds extensively. "Our only hope lies in severing it before the final ritual can be completed. And that means we must be willing to do whatever proves necessary, regardless of the cost to our own souls." The dragon's tooth dagger seemed to pulse with anticipation in its concealment, as if the ancient weapon sensed that its long wait for blood was finally coming to an end. Tomorrow would bring either salvation or damnation for all involved, and the choice between them would be made with steel rather than prayer. The phoenix feather pendant rested against Isolde's heart like a captured flame, its iridescent surface shifting between gold and crimson as it pulsed in rhythm with her increasingly supernatural heartbeat. Lucien had presented the ancient talisman to her as the sun set on what would be her final day as a mortal. explaining that the mystical artifact would protect her during the transformation and serve as a symbol of the rebirth that awaited her. It was worn by the first of my kind to successfully share immortality with a mortal companion, he had told her as he fastened the delicate chain around her neck. The phoenix represents death and renewal, the endless cycle that you will join when darkness falls tonight. Now, she stood in the castle's highest chamber, a circular room whose walls were carved with symbols that seemed to move and shift when observed directly. Candles arranged in precise patterns provided illumination that cast no shadows, while braziers burned with flames that gave off heat but consumed no fuel. The transformation ritual required preparations that had taken centuries to perfect, each element carefully designed to ease the transition from mortal to immortal existence. Lucien moved about the chamber with practiced efficiency, adjusting the placement of ceremonial objects that held power accumulated across millennia. A chalice forged from meteoric silver sat at the room's center, its surface inscribed with words in a language that predated human civilization. Beside it lay a scroll containing the incantations that would bind the essences together for eternity, written in ink mixed from his own immortal blood and herbs, gathered under specific astronomical conditions. "Are you certain of your choice?" he asked, pausing in his preparations to study her face with eyes that held both love and concern. "Once the ritual begins, there can be no retreat from the path we have chosen. You will leave behind every aspect of your mortal existence, your need for sleep, your dependence on food, your connection to the natural cycles that have governed your life since birth." Isolde touched the phoenix pendant at her throat, feeling its warmth spread through her chest like liquid fire. "I am certain. My mortal life ended when Thomas and Marcus died. What you offer me is not the loss of humanity, but the chance to build something new from the ashes of what was destroyed." Her words carried conviction, born from weeks of careful consideration. She had explored every aspect of immortality with the thoroughness of someone who had spent her life making decisions that affected others' welfare. Lucien had hidden nothing from her, neither the powers she would gain nor the prices she would pay for them. She would never again age or sicken, but she would also never again feel the simple pleasure of sunshine on her skin. She would possess strength and speed beyond mortal limitations, but she would also hunger for blood in ways that might challenge the healer's oath she had taken to do no harm. Most significantly, she would be bound to Lucien by ties that transcended anything mortals understood as love. Their connection would be absolute and eternal, allowing them to share thoughts, emotions, and experiences across any distance. They would become two aspects of a single immortal being, complementary halves of a whole that could never again exist independently. "The villagers suspect what we intend," Lucien said, returning to his preparations while keeping his attention partially focused on her responses. "Lord Aldrich and Father Benedict have been asking questions that suggest they understand more about our nature than would be safe to ignore. Are you prepared for the possibility that they may attempt to interfere? Elena tried to warn me away from you when she visited this afternoon," Isolde replied, settling into a chair carved from a single piece of obsidian. She spoke of damnation and corruption, of choosing duty over desire. "I told her that some loves are worth any price, including the disapproval of those who cannot understand them." The conversation with her oldest friend had been painful in ways she had not anticipated. Elena had approached the topic carefully, speaking of concerns for Isolde's spiritual welfare and the strange changes others had observed in her behavior. When gentle persuasion failed, she had become more direct, revealing that she knew about the midnight meetings and begging Isolde to consider the consequences of whatever bargain she was contemplating. "You were the one who taught me that healing sometimes requires cutting away diseased flesh to save the healthy tissue," Isolde had told her friend. "My grief was killing me slowly, destroying everything good that remained in my life. Lucien has shown me how to cut that disease away and replace it with something that will never sicken or die." Elena had left in tears, unable to accept that what she saw as corruption might actually be salvation. The parting had hurt Isolde more than she cared to admit, but she understood that some bridges burned themselves when crossed. Tonight would sever many connections to her former life, and she had made peace with that necessity. Lucien completed his ritual preparations as the last light faded from the sky beyond the chamber's windows. The chalice now glowed with inner radiance that had nothing to do with reflected candlelight, and the air itself seemed to thicken with power that made breathing feel like drawing liquid into her lungs. He approached her with solemnity, appropriate to the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. "Before we begin," he said, taking her hands in his with gentle reverence, "I must tell you something that may change your understanding of what brought us together." Isolde felt a chill of premonition that had nothing to do with the chamber's supernatural atmosphere. "What have you not shared with me?" "Your family name carries more significance than you were raised to know," Lucien replied, his ancient eyes holding regret for secrets he had kept too long. "The Blackthorn bloodline once included nobility who ruled these lands, and one of your ancestors made a bargain similar to the one we contemplate tonight." The revelation struck her like cold water, though she found herself less surprised than she should have been. Too many things about her relationship with Lucien had felt like destiny rather than chance. The ease with which she had found him, the immediate connection between their minds, the way his castle's magic had welcomed rather than repelled her presence. Lord Marcus Blackthorn sought immortality to escape grief, much like your own, Lucien continued, his voice gentle but unflinchingly honest. "I granted his request in 1456, but vampire hunters discovered our bond and destroyed him before we could complete the full transformation. I have waited 5 centuries for another of his bloodline to possess both the strength to survive the change and the motivation to choose it willingly." Isolde absorbed this information with the calm acceptance of someone who had suspected deeper currents beneath the surface of their relationship. "You have been watching my family across generations, waiting for the right moment to approach." "I have been hoping," he corrected softly, "hoping that someday I might find another soul capable of sharing eternity without losing the essential humanity that makes such sharing worthwhile. When I learned of your losses and the depth of your despair, I allowed myself to believe that fate had finally provided what I had been seeking. And now you fear that I will see your interest as manipulation rather than love," she said, understanding the source of his reluctance to reveal this truth earlier. "I fear many things about what we attempt tonight," Lucien admitted. "I fear that I am asking you to sacrifice too much for the sake of my own loneliness. I fear that the hunters who destroyed Marcus will find us before we can complete what he and I began. Most of all, I fear that you will regret choosing eternity with someone whose love is shadowed by centuries of selfish desire." Isolde rose from her chair and moved to stand before him, placing her hands on either side of his face with the tenderness of someone who had spent her life offering comfort to those in pain. "Listen to me carefully, Lucien. I do not care whether you sought me out or I found you by accident. I do not care whether our love was prophesied by ancient magic or born from simple human need. What matters is that when we are together, I feel more alive than I have since my family died." She kissed him with passion that left no room for doubt about her commitment, pouring into that contact all the love she had thought was buried with Thomas and Marcus. When they finally separated, her eyes held determination that could have moved mountains. "Begin the ritual," she said, her voice steady with resolve that came from the deepest places of her heart. "Whatever comes after tonight, I choose to face it at your side." Outside the castle, shadows moved with purpose that had nothing to do with natural wind patterns. Lord Aldrich and Father Benedict approached through darkness that seemed to resist their passage, bearing weapons blessed by saints and carrying the weight of duty that demanded terrible choices. The final confrontation was about to begin, and blood would flow before dawn touched the mountain peaks. The sacred chalice glowed like captured starlight as Lucien lifted it between his hands. the meteoric silver warming to match the supernatural energy that filled the transformation chamber. Ancient words in a language that predated human civilization flowed from his lips as he began the ritual that would bind their souls across eternity. Isolde knelt before him on the stone floor, the phoenix pendant at her throat, pulsing in rhythm with the power building around them. "Drink, beloved," he whispered, offering her the chalice that contained his immortal essence, mixed with wines aged in cellars that had forgotten the touch of sunlight. "Let our blood become one blood, our life become one life, our eternity become shared rather than solitary." Isolde accepted the vessel with hands that trembled not from fear, but from anticipation of transformation beyond anything mortal flesh had ever experienced. The liquid within tasted of copper and starlight, of power distilled from centuries of existence that transcended death itself. As it flowed down her throat, she felt fire spreading through her veins, while her heart began beating in harmonies that human hearts had never known. The change began immediately, starting in her chest and radiating outward like ripples across the surface of a supernatural lake. Her bones strengthened and lengthened, her muscles developing power that could shatter stone, her senses expanding to perceive layers of reality that mortals never suspected existed. The pain was exquisite rather than agonizing, like being reborn in flame that purified rather than consumed. Lucien watched her transformation with wonder that 8 centuries of existence had not diminished, marveling at the grace with which she accepted changes that would have driven weaker souls to madness. Her silver hair darkened to lustrous black, her aging skin smoothing to porcelain perfection, her eyes taking on depths that reflected the accumulated wisdom of immortal perception. The ritual chamber's carved walls began resonating with harmonics that spoke of ancient magic awakening after long dormancy. Symbols that had remained dark for centuries burst into radiance as the castle itself recognized and welcomed its new mistress. The very stones seemed to sing with joy at the completion of bonds that had been severed by violence 500 years ago. Then the great doors exploded inward in a shower of splinters and blessed steel, admitting figures whose presence brought the stench of holy oils and righteous fury. Lord Aldrich strode into the chamber with the dragon's tooth dagger blazing in his grip, its obsidian blade drinking the supernatural light, while Father Benedict followed close behind, his consecrated cross burning like a miniature sun against the darkness. "Step away from her, creature of darkness," Aldrich commanded, his voice carrying the authority of generations who had faced immortal evil without flinching. "Release your hold on this woman's soul before God's judgment falls. Upon you both." Lucien moved with fluid grace to place himself between the intruders and Isolde, whose transformation had reached the critical stage where interruption could destroy both her mortal life and her chance at immortality. His fangs extended as ancient power flowed through him like lightning given form, his eyes blazing with protective fury that had leveled mountains in ages past. "You are too late, Hunter," he said, his voice resonating with supernatural force that made the chamber's stones tremble. "The bond is already forming. Attempt to sever it now, and you will kill the very woman you claim to save." Behind him, Isolde struggled against transformation energies that threatened to tear her apart if not properly guided to completion. The phoenix pendant blazed against her chest like a fragment of the sun itself, its protective magic fighting to stabilize changes that human flesh was never meant to endure. She could feel her mortality slipping away like water through at her fingers, replaced by something vast and terrible and beautiful beyond description. "Elena," she gasped, recognizing her oldest friend among the figures crowding through the shattered doorway. "Please understand, this is not corruption but salvation." Elena Hartwell stood frozen in the entrance, her face wet with tears as she witnessed the friend she had known for 40 years, becoming something that challenged every belief she held about the nature of life and death. Father Benedict moved toward Isolde with pastoral concern, overriding his fear of the supernatural forces swirling through the chamber. "My child," the priest said, his voice gentle despite the terrible circumstances. It is not too late to choose salvation over damnation. Renounce this unholy bargain and return to the light that has always guided your path. This is my light, Isolde replied, her voice gaining strength that came from sources beyond mortal flesh. For months, I dwelt in darkness deeper than any grave, dead to joy and hope and love itself. Lucien has shown me how to live again, how to love again, how to serve others with power that will never fail or fade. Lord Aldrich raised the dragon's tooth dagger, its ancient metal, singing with eagerness for vampire blood. Then you have chosen damnation, and we must choose duty over mercy. He lunged forward with supernatural speed of his own, the blessed blade aimed at Lucien's heart with precision born from generations of training. But the vampire moved faster still, deflecting the strike with strength that sent the hunter stumbling backward into Father Benedict's protective embrace. The battle for Isolde's soul had begun in earnest, and its outcome would determine not only their individual fates, but the balance between mortal and immortal realms that had stood unchanged for centuries. In the swirling chaos of transformation, magic, and holy fury, love and duty prepared to test their relative power through trial by combat that would leave none of them unchanged. The crown of thorns circlet materialized from shadow and starlight as Isolde's transformation reached its crescendo. The ancient vampire royal artifact settling around her brow with the weight of destiny finally fulfilled. Forged from metals that existed only in the space between worlds, the crown marked her as Lucien's eternal mate and equal, no longer mortal supplicant, but immortal queen sharing dominion over realms both earthly and supernatural. Power flowed through her newly immortal form like molten gold, every cell of her being singing with strength that could reshape reality through will alone. She rose from her knees with grace that belonged to creatures of legend, her transformation complete and her nature forever changed. The woman who had knelt as a grieving healer now stood as something magnificent and terrible, beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, yet retaining the essential compassion that had always defined her deepest character. Behold what love can accomplish when it transcends the boundaries. Mortals accept as law, Lucien said, his voice resonating with pride and wonder as he gazed upon his transformed mate. She is no longer the village healer you once knew, but neither is she lost to darkness. She has become something new, immortal guardian of both mortal and supernatural realms. Lord Aldrich circled them with the dragon's tooth dagger held in guard position, his warrior's instincts calculating angles and opportunities, while his family's ancient hatred burned in his eyes. Pretty words cannot disguise the abomination you have created, vampire. She may retain memories of her former humanity, but her soul belongs to darkness now. Does it? Isolde asked, her voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber's stones resonate with sympathetic vibrations. She gestured toward Elena, who cowered near the shattered doorway, and spoke with gentle authority that held no threat despite its supernatural power. Come to me, dearest friend. Let me show you that love has not made me monster, but has instead revealed what I was always meant to become. Elena took hesitant steps forward, drawn by bonds of friendship that 40 years had woven too strong to break, even in the face of transformation beyond understanding. When she reached Isolde's side, the newly immortal woman took her friend's hands with touch that remained warm and comforting, despite the supernatural fire burning within her veins. I am still the woman who sat with you when your children died, Isolde said softly, her eyes holding depths that spoke of wisdom gained rather than innocence lost. Still the healer who taught you to brew willowbark tea for your husband's pain. Death has not claimed me. Elena, it has simply taught me that there are forms of life beyond those we thought possible. Father Benedict approached with his consecrated cross, held before him, expecting the blessed silver to burn immortal flesh as church. Doctrine promised. Instead, The holy symbol grew warm with radiance that seemed to welcome rather than repel Isolde's presence, as if recognizing something sacred in her transformation rather than profane corruption. "This cannot be," the priest whispered, staring at his cross as understanding dawned that challenged everything he had been taught about the nature of good and evil. "The blessed silver should burn those who have chosen darkness over light." "Perhaps," Isolde replied with gentle wisdom that carried no judgment, "the light is larger than any of us understood. Perhaps love itself is sacred, regardless of the forms it takes or the prices it demands." Her words struck Father Benedict with the force of revelation, and he found himself reconsidering doctrines he had never questioned in 30 years of faithful service. Could it be that God's love was vast enough to encompass even this supernatural union? Could it be that salvation took forms that mortal theology had never imagined? Lord Aldrich felt the certainty that had sustained his family for generations beginning to crumble as he witnessed Isolde's retention of essential humanity despite her immortal transformation. The dragon's toothed dagger wavered in his grip as doubt crept into convictions that had once seemed absolute. His ancestors' teaching spoke of vampires as irredeemably evil, yet what he saw before him challenged those beliefs with evidence that could not be denied. "The bond between us protects more than ourselves," Lucien said, moving to stand beside his immortal mate with hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Through our union, the barriers between mortal and supernatural realms will strengthen rather than weaken. She brings to immortality the healer's oath to do no harm, while I bring to her the power to enforce that oath across centuries of service." Isolde nodded, feeling the truth of their shared purpose flowing through consciousness that now spanned dimensions mortals could never perceive. "I will use these new abilities to protect both worlds, healing what can be healed, guarding what must be guarded, bridging the gap between mortal need and immortal power." Elena released breath she had not realized she was holding, finally understanding that her friend's choice had been guided by wisdom rather than corruption. "You mean to become protector rather than predator. We mean to become what this realm has needed for centuries but never possessed," Isolde confirmed. The crown of thorns circlet, blazing with light that illuminated truth in every corner of the chamber. "Immortal guardians who remember what it means to be mortal, supernatural beings who choose to serve rather than to dominate." Lord Aldrich lowered the dragon's tooth dagger as the weight of generations of mistaken certainty settled on his shoulders like lead. Perhaps the real monsters were those who could not recognize love when it transcended the boundaries they had drawn around acceptable forms of existence. The battle for Isolde's soul was over, but the greater war between understanding and prejudice had only just begun. The twin wedding rings gleamed in the morning light, streaming through the cottage windows, their meteoric metal surfaces reflecting depths that seemed to contain the very essence of eternity itself. Isolde turned the simple band around her finger, marveling at how something so modest in appearance could symbolize a bond that transcended every boundary between mortal and immortal existence. The matching ring on Lucien's hand pulsed with gentle warmth whenever they were apart, a constant reminder of the connection that now defined their shared existence. 6 months had passed since the night of her transformation, 6 months during which the village of Ashenhall had slowly adapted to the reality of having immortal protectors who remembered what it meant to be human. The initial fear and suspicion had given way to cautious acceptance, as people witnessed the beneficial changes that Isolde and Lucien's presence brought to their community. The herb garden behind her cottage had grown beyond anything nature should have allowed, producing healing plants with properties enhanced by supernatural influence, yet guided by the same compassionate purpose that had always motivated her work. Children who had once suffered through winter fevers now recovered within hours of receiving her treatments. broken bones mended with impossible speed, and illnesses that would have claimed lives now surrendered to remedies that combined ancient botanical knowledge with power drawn from immortal sources. Mrs. Blackthorne, young Timothy Mason, called from the garden gate, using the formal address the village had adopted in recognition of her transformed status. "Mother sent me to ask if you have any of the pain remedy for grandfather's joints. The autumn dampness is troubling him again." Isolde smiled at the boy with the same warmth she had always shown to the village children, though now her affection was backed by protective instincts that could level mountains if threats arose against those under her care. "Tell your mother I will bring the tincture this afternoon, along with enough dried chamomile to last through the winter months." Timothy nodded eagerly and ran back toward his family's cottage, comfortable with their immortal healer in ways that spoke well of childhood's adaptability to wonder. The adults had required more time to accept the changes, but even the most skeptical had been won over by evidence of Isolde's unchanged devotion to their welfare. Elena Hartwell emerged from the cottage carrying a tea service that had become ritual between them, their friendship transformed but not diminished by supernatural circumstances beyond ordinary understanding. The baker's wife had become something of a bridge between the immortal couple and the mortal community, helping to explain decisions and reassure those who still harbored doubts about their protector's intentions. "Father Benedict sends his regards," Elena said as she settled beside her transformed friend on the wooden bench Thomas had built decades ago. "He wanted you to know that the new church records officially recognize your marriage under divine law, regardless of what certain visiting authorities might claim about supernatural unions." The priest's acceptance had been perhaps the most significant victory in their integration with village life. After weeks of prayer and study, Father Benedict had concluded that love, capable of inspiring such selfless service, could not be considered contrary to divine will, regardless of the unusual circumstances surrounding its expression. His public blessing of their union had done much to silence remaining opposition from the community's more conservative members. "And Lord Aldrich?" Isolde asked, though she had already sensed his presence approaching through the supernatural awareness that came with immortality. "Has he reached any conclusions about what he witnessed that night?" "See for yourself," Elena replied, nodding toward the figure walking up the cottage path with measured steps that spoke of someone still adjusting worldviews that had been shattered by encounter with truth. Lord Aldrich approached with the dragon's tooth dagger sheathed at his side. The ancient weapon now carried more as symbol of office than instrument of destruction. His investigation into other vampire encounters throughout history had revealed a pattern his family had never recognized, evidence that not all supernatural transformations led to corruption, and that some immortal beings chose service over domination. "Lady Isolde," he said, offering a respectful bow that acknowledged her noble heritage while recognizing her transformed status. "I bring word from the capital. The church hierarchy has agreed to establish this region as a protected sanctuary, acknowledging your authority to maintain peace between mortal and supernatural inhabitants." The formal recognition represented months of negotiation, during which Aldrich had argued passionately for a new approach to vampire-mortal relations. His family's archives contained enough evidence of beneficial supernatural intervention to support his thesis that blanket hostility served no one's interests. The compromise they had reached allowed for continued vigilance against genuinely malevolent immortals while protecting those who chose to use their powers constructively. Lucien materialized from the shadows at the garden's edge with the fluid grace that marked his immortal nature, though his presence now brought comfort rather than fear to those who knew him. His centuries of isolation had ended not in conquest but in integration, his vast power channeled toward protecting rather than dominating the mortal realm he had once viewed from necessary distance. "The mountain passes are clear," he reported, settling beside Isolde. With the easy intimacy of mates whose souls were bound across eternity, the bandits who had been troubling merchant caravans have decided to seek easier prey elsewhere. Word spreads quickly that this region enjoys supernatural protection. Their shared reign over the territory had brought unprecedented peace and prosperity to communities that had known little of either in recent memory. Trade flourished under their protection. Crops grew with unnatural abundance in soil blessed by immortal influence, and children played in forests where ancient guardians watched over their innocent games. As evening approached and the first stars appeared in skies that held no threat for those under immortal protection, Isolde reflected on the journey that had brought her from devastating grief to transcendent love. The silver locket she still wore contained the faces of Thomas and Marcus, but their memory no longer carried the weight of unbearable sorrow. Instead, it served as reminder that love's capacity for growth exceeded every limitation mortality sought to impose upon it. The twin wedding rings pulsed with shared warmth as Lucien took her hand, their meteoric metal reflecting starlight that would shine on their love for centuries yet to come. What had begun as a desperate quest for oblivion had become instead a celebration of existence that honored both the mortal lives they remembered and the immortal future they would build together. In the cottage where she had once prepared to abandon all hope, Isolde now planned adventures that would span millennia, secure in love that had proven stronger than death, time, and every force that sought to divide hearts, meant to beat as one across all the ages of the world.